We had a fabulous day yesterday where we heard about amazing applications and new developments of AI at the frontier of science. And I'm delighted to kind of chair this session now on the kind of use of open science and reproducibility in an area of AI. Now we know that kind of the cornerstone of the scientific method is the notion of falsifiability, following Popper, and it's of course incumbent on all of us to make our results falsifiable. Hopefully not false, but falsifiable, to give people the tools necessary in order to be able to rigorously analyze the evidence that we have. And a kind of a minimal requirement for falsifiability is, of course, reproducibility. Can we actually reproduce the results that were reported? And AI has produced wonderful challenges to us in this very area, principally around the reasons of scale. We heard this yesterday, just the scale of the science that we can now tackle. Very complex problems with multidisciplinary teams, lots of decision-making processes happening from the idealization or the creation of the idea through to the creation of a final conclusion or summary conclusion or product. And there are many paths that you can take along that. And then there's the scale of the models. We heard that yesterday, uber large foundation models with trillions or billions of parameters that sit on top of a scale of data that we've never had access before. And a well-known result with the amount of digital data doubling every 2 years means that we can now tackle these large-scale problems with the compute and the models. And this, of course, brings a scale of reporting challenge with it, and a scale of reproducibility challenge, which is how do we start to track all the paths that started from the beginning to the end? When the data is confidential or has issues of confidentiality and there's issues of intellectual property around the models, how as we as a community can ensure as best we can that we communicate in a way that accelerates the scientific method, that leads to new exploration and new results? And how do we reward all of the hard work, the additional barriers to making your results reproducible and your work falsifiable? And so with that, I'm going to open the session, and I'm delighted to have our first speaker, who's Victoria Stodden from the University of Southern California. Victoria's expertise is in the analysis around the reliability of scientific results, particularly in computational methods. She has a book on this area, Implementing Reproducible Research, and has previously served as the associate editor for the Harvard Data Science Review. So please welcome Victoria to the stage. Thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, especially to talk to you all about a subject that I think is so important and very close to my heart. So my talk today is entitled On Emergent Limits to Knowledge, with the subtitle, or How to Trust the Robot Researcher's a Pocket Guide. And what I'd like to talk to you today in my 15 minutes, starting in 1660, I'll lay some of the foundational framework for why we do science the way we do today, and what are we doing today in leveraging AI, at least from my perspective, and how does that impact what we may have thought was the framework for doing good science and reporting good science in the 1660s. And then I'd like to take you on a 2-minute odyssey into science 2050, and try to convince you that what we are facing is an emergent digital scholarly record running alongside what we now consider our scholarly record, or this sort of bucket of PDFs that we have. Okay, so the idea of a scientific fact goes back to 1267 with Roger Bacon, and he said, what are we going to do to establish a scientific fact? Verify our conclusions by direct experiment, discover our truths in ways that are unreachable by other methods, and this will allow us to investigate the secrets of nature, opening us to a knowledge of past and future. So this is our very familiar cycle of deductive reasoning, observation, hypothesis, experimentation. Even in this day, he still recorded his experiments in enough detail, ideally to permit reproducibility by others. So right from the beginning, if you consider this the beginning, we had this idea that there was a community involved, and somehow we were sharing discoveries about the natural world across society. Okay, fast forward, 1620. Nova Morganum, actually related Bacon, Francis Bacon, introduces to us this idea of inductive reasoning. So we're gathering facts by observation and experimentation, and then that allows us to verify these general principles. So we can go from the particular to the general, and the general back to the particular, is what he's saying. Okay, so now we have this sense of inductive scientific reasoning. Now, I couldn't help but notice and take real pleasure in saying that another milestone, 1660, happened, at least in this society. So with the Invisible College became the advent of a more formal structure of the journal about how we report out these scientific experiments, whether deductive or inductive, and how we share them with the community. So a little bit of history. Henry Oldenburg, the first secretary, got frustrated with all these letters going around between the different scientific researchers, decided to organize them, and that was Transactions, giving some of the accomplishments of the present undertaking, studies, and labors of the ingenious in many considerable parts of the world. So at the same time, and part of the Invisible College was Robert Boyle, whom of course many know in some sense as the father of chemistry and many other aspects of modern science. So Boyle writes at the time, it's much more difficult than most men can imagine to make an accurate experiment. And he's well known among all his other discoveries for, in a sense, embedding this concept of reproducibility the way that we understand it today in our communication of scientific results. So he says this in very colorfully named works, certain philosophical essays and other tracts written at distant times and on several occasions by the Honorable Robert Boyle. That was 1673. So in his work of 1660, new experiments, physico-mechanical, touching the spring of the air and its effects, he really set our standard for reproducible communication, enough detail on the equipment, material, procedures for others to independently reproduce. So this is still our modern standard in publication. Whether we meet it or not is another question. It's still our standard. He had the idea of communal witnessing, so people would gather and watch the experiment unfold, and in a sense, that would lend verifiability to those results, that there was this witness, and even the witnesses would sign as co-authors if they watched the experiment. He also was a proponent of exhaustive details on experimental settings, false starts, failures, things that didn't work, paths you didn't go down, and so on. So this is also a modern topic in reproducibility discussions around p-hacking and cherry-picking results and so on. But we actually knew all this back in 1660. Okay, let's fast forward to today. So now we're in the midst of what I think is an unstoppable force. Very little scientific research goes on now that's not highly computationally complex, both in the data, in the steps in the workflow, and how we reach the conclusions that we stand behind. The reaction in my own work has been among this: open, transparent, re-executable machine learning and other discovery pipelines, open data, and so on. And it didn't just happen yesterday, but my research agenda has largely been turned on its head by AI. And many of these goals don't match where we are and where we're going in this, as a scientific community. So now we're faced with, again, in my opinion, very deeply disruptive innovation, not just in the science and in the discoveries, but in the discovery process itself. So we saw many talks yesterday extolling the virtues of what was called the Common Task Framework. This is largely new, coming from about the 1960s, I think, is the earliest. So certainly nothing the Bacons or Boyle would have known anything about. So very new discovery methods, bringing with it new ways of understanding what it means to have a finding. Leveraging LLMs, we saw quite a bit of this, and other very complex large models yesterday. So nobody really talked about creating that PDF and publishing the paper. After that, we saw a few citations. But in a sense, I got the impression that publishing that PDF is something of an afterthought after all of this computational heavy lifting that's gone on. So our research now, this is my deduction, it's being shared digitally, natively, in how it was constructed and implemented, rather than in our traditional PDFs and the papers. It's always an afterthought. Okay, so what has happened to Boyle's standards? Boyle's standards, do they even make sense in this context? So I think this is the first time since about 1660 where they don't make sense and they're not feasible. So we're deeply disrupting our scientific norms. We're not saying we have these standards and how do we meet them with these new computational tools we're leveraging, with big data-enabled discoveries, huge models, and so on. That's really not what we're saying. I've said it for years, but I'm not saying it anymore. It's not the same standards that we're trying to meet. It's really kind of new standards. And how do we achieve notions of transparency, accountability, reproducibility? How do we know it's correct? We saw bits and pieces of it yesterday, right? With verifiability, comparison to results, similar to what we have seen develop in very large simulations. But I think we're on the cusp. Okay, at a risk of somewhat maybe embarrassing my colleagues, I also took some bits and pieces from yesterday's discussion. Okay, so let's fast forward again, 2050, we're on a science odyssey. Now we're in a world, let's say, some future version, bigger than we can certainly think of now, of LLMs. They're leveraged for metadata completion of complex and integrated data sets. We're going beyond cracking nuts. This is a standard way we're doing science. We're benchmarking our clear and concise definition of a solution. This is routinely what we do. We teach our students to do this. We teach our students how to pose a good question. That's what we spend our time with them in school. What do we have now? Our product is a black box pipeline with this best solution. What does best mean? Best means it followed our procedures and our practices. Getting these extraordinary discoveries in 2050. Okay, so how do we know it's correct? We followed our procedures. Other people followed procedures as well. We've got conflicting results. How do we break the tie or decide which one's best or correct? Well, we heard yesterday some hints of, well, we'll just ask an LLM. What's correct? Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is what are we losing, right, in a sense, in a trade-off for these discoveries? We're losing our ability to follow that chain of reasoning in our own heads. And back to the Bacons, Boyle, and our researchers even through to today, science has always been about instructing us, right, how we understand the natural world. And what can we learn and how do we leverage that knowledge? Now we're at this inflection point where we're moving away from our own understanding being the goal of science. Now we no longer will be able to understand that chain of reasoning that led to the results. I think we're entering a phase of discovery where we understand and trust processes, we understand confirmatory results, but we don't necessarily understand that chain of logic anymore. Okay, so what's this going to do? So all of this produces digital scholarly objects of all manner and shapes, ones yet to be seen. That, I believe, is going to become our scholarly record, and maybe the PDFs, sort of the bucket of PDFs, will continue or not. I don't think it's going to matter that much. Our emergent scholarly record will be this collection of these digital scholarly objects that come about from doing this research. So frameworks, training data, leaderboard results, things that don't fit neatly into our current scholarly record. Correctness, which now, to some degree, we verify through transparency, human verification, can I follow what the other researchers have done? Now we will move to what I call, this morning I started calling it sort of meta-Bacon methodology. So we go back to 1267, Roger Bacon. Instead, now, of our own scientific results, we will have verification of the conclusion by direct experimentation on our own black boxes, our own pipelines of discovery. Discovery of truths unreachable by other approaches, and an investigation of the secrets of black box discovery methods themselves, opening us to a knowledge of past and future. So this is this idea of prodding on these discovery pipelines rather than being able to kind of explicate all the steps. So we're no longer touching the spring of the air, but we're instead generating a collection of useful results that work. So the chain of logic behind the discoveries is accessible maybe behind large models and impenetrable code, impenetrable to us. And this chain of logic will be yet to be discovered, or sort of accessible by yet to be discovered tools that allow us to query these pipelines. And that's what gives us our confidence that these results stand or are correct. Okay, well, where does that leave authorship? Even Boyle talked about the importance of authorship with his witnessing of the experiments and signing of the letters and so on. So this effectively demotes or even destroys authorship. How do you know whose idea is involved in that black box chain of reasoning? How do you even know what ideas are involved? Even now, in our sort of casual use of LLMs, we don't know and can't say how these results were arrived at or where they came from. I played with one this morning. I could see traces of Wikipedia in some of the answers, but I didn't really know the provenance of that result, and there's no way for me to find out. So who's the author? Whose idea does this work build on? What ideas does the result build on? So these are foundational, canonical questions we always answer today in science as we publish. We're moving to a world where we're not going to be able to answer them. And it doesn't matter if we understand ourselves how we got that result, or maybe why that result is right or wrong. But we need to be able to just query to get that result. Just completely different. Okay, so knowledge becomes something that's useful, not necessarily something that's about our understanding. So in 2050, researchers and presumably everyone else, they believe the results are correct because they just trust their own opaque discovery processes. I think this is where we have to go. What is that? A meaningful precision of the problem description, correctness of the benchmarks. This is what we'll discuss and agree on. Appropriateness of the data, right? That's a relatively new topic and I think incredibly important. So we're developing in a way a scientific method for challenges, not necessarily for our traditional deductive or inductive reasoning. So what problems lend themselves best to the challenge approach? Are some better at it or going to be more successful than others? Very likely. What data attributes are essential for success? We've seen a number of examples already where very large data sets, very famous data sets have been used to answer questions that they don't quite match, right? And there's extrapolation problems that come out. So who wins and who loses in this world? Are these challenge problems easier for certain types of researchers? Presumably, certainly researchers that have access to infrastructure at scale. Right. Okay, so our computable digital scholarly record, ideally, will be able to, or someone, or maybe some infrastructure will be able to regenerate these computational results. Of course, that's limited by scale. But remember, scale today is maybe not scale tomorrow, maybe not in 2050. It will allow us to do comparisons and reconciliation of different hypotheses, or maybe an LLM does this, or some integration in the scholarly record does this in an automated way. You know, we could imagine things like that. Re-implement the methods on new data. So a scholarly record, this collection of digital scholarly objects, data can connect to methods. Our generation and evolution of benchmarks, standardized test beds will take a sort of front position. Development and application of appropriate policy. So now we can sort of think through the policies that attend to this collection of objects. And it will still, this in my imagination, will still act as a traditional scholarly record because it's a locus, again, for the community, the research community to come together, share ideas, get feedback, improve their work, agree on priorities, resolve debates, all the things that, not all the things, some of the things that the scholarly record does today will just transfer over to this emergent digital scholarly record. Okay, so my conclusion. So challenge problems, large opaque models will dominate scientific research. All of these ideas that are traditional to science that we can't even imagine a world without are going to just go by the wayside. Authorship, personal accountability, not no accountability, but personal accountability by an author. Human accessible chains of scientific reasoning. And then we're faced with this emergent scholarly record, and my call is that we could perhaps have an opportunity to be proactive about what that digital scholarly record, that native scholarly record looks like now before it's also just a bucket of digital detritus. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you. So that's obviously created by ChatGPT.
Excellent, thank you so much. Just to remind everybody that we have a panel discussion at the end and then breakout groups. So please do note your questions, but hold them for now. So next up we have Sasha Lucioni, who is the climate lead at Hugging Face, which is an organisation we all know, responsible for open source AI and sustainability of AI systems. Sasha is a founding member of the Climate Change AI group and a board member of the Women in Machine Learning. We're delighted to have her speak to us today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here. As Chris said, these are the three hats I wear because there are three things I care deeply about. So on one hand, I am the climate lead at Hugging Face, and I do believe on the importance of open science and open source, and I lead the work on evaluating both the environmental and societal impacts of AI models and data sets there. But also, I'm a board member of Women in Machine Learning. We have a big gender diversity crisis in AI. I think the estimate is that roughly 15% of AI researchers are women, and obviously promoting and making a safe space and highlighting the work of women in AI is really important. And like, for example, I started at the WIML, Women in AI and Machine Learning workshop when I was a grad student, and it gave me a place to kind of feel welcome. And Climate Change AI is a volunteer initiative that we founded 5 years ago now, and to fight the climate crisis using machine learning methods. So today I'll talk to you about reproducibility, ethics, and sustainability, which I think are really linked. And so I'll talk to you about what's already been done, but also transversal concepts that I find are very important for these three fields. So representativeness, evaluation, and transparency, and hopefully connect the dots a little bit on how all three come together and why reproducibility and ethics can contribute towards improving the sustainability of AI systems. So as an introduction, as Chris said, succinctly, reproducibility of results is a really core tenet of scientific practice, and I feel that in machine learning we kind of forget that a lot. And in recent years, several studies have looked at transparency in AI, reproducibility in AI, and found that the overwhelming majority of published results don't provide enough information in order to reproduce the results that they report. There's always something missing, either a random seed, either the code, either the data, either the model weights. Something is always missing in order to really have reproducibility. And I think that above and beyond core scientific practice, which of course is very important, improving the reproducibility of machine learning can also help the ethical aspects of AI in order, for example, to provide a bed for testing these models, for detecting biases, for improving the fairness, but also sustainability, because ultimately you you reduce wasted resources, you improve the building upon existing work, and so you don't always have to start from scratch. And actually, when I was looking for a position after my postdoc, I found that Hugging Face is kind of like recycling for AI models, and I'm a big fan of recycling. And so I was like, well, it's a place where you can I mean, and like thrift shopping. I'm also a big fan of thrift shopping. And it's like a place of like, you can share, you can give like, your models, and someone can download the models, and you can fine tune the models, but you don't necessarily have to train from scratch. And so I was kind of like, in my very hippie nature, I was like, I'm going to go to Hugging Face because it's a place where, you know, we can reduce wasted resources and reduce reuse cycle. So that kind of the life story. Let's talk a little bit about existing work. So in terms of AI principles and frameworks, it's interesting because there's a lot of AI principles, and I'm sure you've seen a lot. But in 2019, a group of researchers reviewed 84 separate sets of ethical guidelines and principles, and found very limited convergence. And so often in practice, what happens is that these principles, these theoretical frameworks, fall short in addressing the actual complex ethical problems that AI faces on a day-to-day basis. So improving this really necessitates not only nuance and context-specific approaches, but also in taking into account various aspects of AI that are, for example, the environmental implications, but also kind of the links between AI and society. So, for example, principles like this, like typically principles look something like this. This is an extract of the Montreal Declaration of AI. And so typically you have things like diversity inclusion, like prudence, like responsibility, like sustainable development. But at the end of the day, how do you interpret these things? How do you actually apply them in the exact context where you're creating an autonomous vehicle, when you're, you know, flying a drone, when you're, you know, training a large language model? What does diversity inclusion mean? What does prudence mean in all of these different contexts? And at the end of the day, what the study found is that everyone interprets them differently. And for me, you know, in this particular context, prudence can mean this, and then in another context, it can mean something else entirely, because we're talking about theoretical principles. And to support this work, there was a really interesting study that looked at AI as a distributed field and looked at how these principles, these theoretical, really kind of like fundamental AI principles, are operationalized. And so the study from 2 years ago now looked at papers submitted at kind of big machine learning conferences, things like conferences like NeurIPS, International Conference of Machine Learning, and looked at the values that the authors presented. And so essentially what they insisted was important in their own work. So they did this meta-analysis, and then what they found was 59 different values, but not a single one was linked neither to sustainability, which is kind of my particular horse, but also, or reproducibility as well. So it was things like performance, generalization, efficiency sometimes. Oh, there you go. Novelty, of course, applying to real world, right? Large scale, robustness. And so these are the things that people kept coming back to. Our model improves upon past work, right? Our model has high accuracy. Our model generalizes, but they never really spoke about, you know, our model has a lower carbon footprint, our model is reproducible, et cetera, et cetera. So what's interesting is that there are all these principles in theory, and then the way that they're applied in practice can really differ, but tends to turn around these kinds of sets of values. And for 7 years now, I've been involved in the machine learning reproducibility challenge, and essentially what it does is that it opens up essentially a sort of kind of a hackathon. So we asked the machine learning community to take a paper from the previous year. So for example, now we're looking at 2023 and try to reproduce the results. And it's quite simple. You know, you pick a paper that got Best Paper Award or whatnot, got published at NeurIPS, for example, and you try to get the same result that they report. And what we found is that reproducibility is not binary. It's not yes or no reproducible, but it can also differ depending on essentially like the different characteristics of the models themselves, depending on even the hardware you have access to, depending on the data you're using. So essentially what we found is initially we were going to make, you know, kind of binary 0-1 scores, but we found that it has to be a spectrum. And also, even when code is available, and that's not always the case, reproducibility, it doesn't always give the same results, even if you use the exact same code, because of inherent properties of machine learning models. So for example, hyperparameters, random seeds have a pretty high impact on reproducibility. Stochastic gradient descent, essentially, even if you have all the different elements you would need to reproduce an experiment, and you run all the same things on the hardware you have, the results are different. And also, we found so much redundant reproduction of results. So essentially, because of this issue, because people don't really trust the previous, what previous people reported, they'll tend to reproduce their results or try to rerun the results and say, well, they actually said 95%. What we found is that their method gives 90% and our methods give 92%. So actually, we're better than there. Anyway, so there's a lot of that. And so essentially, this results in wasted compute. So a lot of people are doing the same things over and over. And another initiative that I was involved in is the NeurIPS Code of Ethics. So essentially, last year, the NeurIPS board came to us and asked us to help develop a way to incentivize ethics, sustainability, reproducibility in AI research. And since NeurIPS is the biggest machine learning conference, I think it's something like, 9,000 people that come together every year, a way to essentially guide them towards better scientific practice. And we created this quite long code of ethics, actually. This is a part of it. And we tried to insist on specific aspects and be quite concrete. So safety, for example. So to look at potential harm or injury through application of AI systems. Environmental impacts, we looked at bias and fairness. So essentially we asked people, think about these things and report them or, find ways to measure them. Make sure that, your system does not provide disparate impacts on different communities, even though you tested on one, test on multiple, right? And we also put a special clause for disclosing elements of reproducibility, because we had cases, specific papers actually that won best paper at NeurIPS that didn't provide their code, that didn't provide the data, that just said, we have these amazing results on an agreed upon benchmark and you just have to trust us. And essentially the community at some point was like, well, we'd like to trust you, but we'd also like to build upon your work. And so we added this to the code of ethics. It's still a work in progress. It's still not 100%. But people now can, reviewers can now say, go back to this clause of the code of ethics. You're not providing the data necessary to replicate your results. So work in progress. In the last 5 minutes, I wanted to talk about a couple of concepts that I find keep coming up in different ways with different vocabulary that I find are interesting and important. So, for example, representativeness. So I think that's really one of the core assumptions of AI as a discipline. Like, you assume that the data that you use for training an AI model will allow the model to represent whatever you're trying to represent, right? So, and there's also what I personally call the myth of generalizability, that machine learning models and increasingly large language models are general purpose technologies. Like this, there's even a paper called GPTs or GPTs, so generative pre-trained transformers are general purpose technologies, and that paper keeps using the two acronyms interchangeably. It's very confusing, but people say, well, GPT-3 is a general purpose technology, and you're like, well, first of all, it's the other acronym. But people tend to think that you can kind of reuse these technologies in any application, despite numerous studies showing that this is not the case, that you can't necessarily take a model trained on one task and apply it to another. And also, the results, this results in the need for adaptation as well. Often people will take a model and will fine-tune it, and it will apply it to specific contexts, right? But the actual out-of-the-box transfer learning is pretty rare. And so what we did with a colleague of mine, David Rolnick, we looked at ImageNet, which was talked about yesterday. It's one of the big emblematic data sets in AI. And ImageNet 1K is used for evaluating evaluating AI models. And actually what we found is that of the 1K 1,000 classes, 269 are wild animals. And we kind of got, because we're like big nature geeks, so we wanted to know what's in there. And so we found that with working in tandem with actual experts in the field, we found that 12% of the images are mislabeled, and some classes are over 90% wrong. So actually classes like black-footed ferret, 98% incorrect, rock crab, 96% incorrect. And it was really interesting because this is really like this gold standard data set that's been used for 10 years now. And what we found that the sources of error is everything from, inexperience from annotators, but also prevalence effects, also the fact that, leaf beetle is not a beetle on a leaf, it's an actual type of beetle. And so depending on the categories, the percentage of incorrectness was less or more, but essentially all these domain experts were like, and you guys consider this to be the gold standard? Like, this is embarrassing. And these are the kinds of images that we found. And so this kind of shows that, it's dangerous to use these data sets thinking that they're kind of either high quality or representative of the world at large, because there's also all these very hard to quantify biases. Like almost all the images of fish are of dead fish held by people who fished the fish, and so there's not. I don't know if you saw that there was this meme on the social media at some point. It was like salmon jumping. It was a majestic salmon jumping in a river generated by AI, and it was like steaks of salmon jumping in a river. And so it results in things like this, right? And so essentially, when we train on data sets like this, we we kind of perpetuate these biases or these misrepresentations further on in the chain, and you create cascades. In terms of evaluation, I'm a very big, firm believer of you can't improve what you can't measure. And so essentially what we typically measure is accuracy. What we typically measure is performance. That was the top value that was reported by that study I cited. It was performance, and we're doing great. But having worked in real world kind of applied AI, people tend not to only measure accuracy. They'll tend to make trade-offs between accuracy and efficiency, robustness and efficiency and accuracy. There's always some trade-offs being made. Inclusion, what data is being included. So, and of course, reproducibility of results. Like I actually spent a year working in finance, and you can't just take a model from Hugging Face and then apply it on the stock market. That doesn't work. You need to prove that it's robust. You need to prove that it's representative of the things you want it to be representative of. And so also evaluating multiple aspects of system performance, not just accuracy or performance, and clearly reporting these results for me is really important, because you can reduce redundancy, you can improve also the robustness and the kind of like building upon previous results. And so my current main project is developing Energy Star ratings for AI, because I think that on Hugging Face, when you pick a model, it often tells you, state of the art on this task, on this leaderboard, but it doesn't tell you how much energy it consumes. It doesn't tell you how many emissions it will emit if you deploy it on a given energy grid. So this is ongoing work, but I'm evaluating hundreds of models and trying and on data sets that I've curated myself. So I've created new benchmark data sets that are essentially mixes of existing ones in order to make it a little bit more tricky. It's not just the same data sets over and over. And so I'm testing. So for example, this is some text generation models. On the bottom right is distilled GPT, which is like a distilled version of GPT-2. And then on the top left, you have Phi-3. And what's interesting is that it's the same data set, the same task, the same quantity of data, and you've got a difference between, something like 1 or 2 watt-hours per 1,000 inferences, 1,000 queries, to over 30. So it's a 30-fold difference for the exact same thing that you're doing, right? And so I believe that if we provide this information, people will not only use accuracy to make their decisions, but also efficiency. And also, last thing I want to talk about, transparency. I think it was already briefly touched upon, but these things, transformer type models are not inherently transparent. It's really hard to actually say what's going on under the hood, rather. And so it's really, so I'm going to skip this, but talk about model cards, which I find as a way of kind of getting beyond the inherent lack of transparency of transformer models. So this is a concept that was developed by a colleague of mine, Margaret Mitchell. And so they're a way to understand models and data sets, even in cases where they're inherently hard to understand and to interpret. And so guiding and incentivizing the creation of model cards can improve reproducibility, because here's an example. You have things like, limits, evaluation, environmental impacts. And so it helps people understand these models from an application perspective, even if they don't necessarily understand what's going on under the hood. I know I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to keep your questions, note them, but keep them for the panel discussion. So next up, we have Mark Kelson from the University of Exeter. Mark is a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute and part of the Institute for Data Science and AI at Exeter. And he is the UK Reproducibility Network Institutional Lead. Thank you, Mark.
Hi, everybody. I wasn't fully aware of how illustrious the company was going to be, and if I had been, I might have struck a different tone in my bio sketch. Have a look at that if you get a chance. So I'm going to talk about reproducing what we sow. It's sort of play on reaping what we sow. These are broadly drawn out of reflections that I had. I became one of the interim co-directors of the Institute for Data Science and AI for about 1.5 years while they searched for someone better, which they happily did find. And these are my reflections on some of the issues that I think we are seeing in AI research. So to give you the structure, I got 3 ideas for you. So I think that's reasonable in 15 minutes. The first is about reproducibility in seed corns, or a lack of reproducibility is bad. That's the takeaway message there. Secondly, a case study in reproducibility. This is, I think, a really interesting case study that I'd like to share. I'm sharing it with everybody. Or you could take that as, yeah, the presence of reproducibility is good. And finally, a proposed solution. How do we go from bad to good? And so when I talk about reproducibility, I'm using Kirsty Whitaker and the Alan Turing Institute's categorization. We're up in the top left corner, same code, same data. Do we get the same answer? And I think if we walked outside of this building and grabbed a random pedestrian and said, you know, all that taxpayer money that you pay for research, how often do you think if you gave people the same data and the same code, would you get the same number? Their expectation, I think anybody on the street, would be 100% of the time. How else, what other answer could there possibly be? And my view is that it's virtually 0% of the time. The University of Luxembourg do conduct pre-publication checks on every single article that they publish. They have a team of 7 and this covers 50 researchers. This is the scale of the investment. And we had a talk from them at the UKRN a couple of months back, and one of the questions was, how many of the pre-publication papers sailed through the process, no changes? The answer was 0. So if your institution is not doing this, you are almost certainly publishing research that is not reproducible. Okay, so seed corns. So in the University of Exeter, we have a pool of data scientists, postdoctoral research fellows. Anybody in the university can bid for their time. So if you've got a humanities person, they got some nice labeled data, but they don't have machine learning skills, they can bid for 6 months of one of our fellows' time. That fellow spends half of their time on it, so it's like 3 months of dedicated work. And that's the background. This was one of the seed corns that came in while I was interim co-director. And it was about linking antibiotic resistance genes with E. coli in the water. And a researcher had curated a really rich data set, never before seen. She had information on antibiotic use in farms upstream. She had climate information, how much rainfall was coming down into river systems. She had collected E. coli levels in seawater in coastal bathing regions. And her question was, can we link these two? It's a very complex data set. We'd like to apply some kind of data science machine learning approach. And so 2 of our research fellows set to work. This is Charlie and Finley. And they started off, as you might, with a linear model. And that didn't seem to work very well, so they went to a nonlinear model, which is a reasonable extension. There's a lot of variables, so they thought maybe lasso regression, where they're setting a lot of those parameters to 0. No dice, random forest, Sexter trees regressors. They went Bayesian, they had pooling, partial pooling, hierarchical clustering. In the end, a bespoke decision tree ensemble machine learning algorithm was developed for this purpose. This is the first sentence in the conclusion of the 6-month study, this report. Our experiment suggests there was simply no signal in the provided environmental factors that can answer this question. And so we're left like this. What do we do? Where do we go to publish this work? Who is interested in reading about our failed attempts? Because there's, let's address the elephant in the room. It could be that we're terrible data scientists, right? I mean, that's the competing hypothesis. Maybe there's no signal. Maybe we're very bad at this. And so, we need to get people to trust us. So this is basically the situation we're in. I think we have a real, looming crisis in data science and AI. This work is systematically not being published. So if you go to the literature and you say, is data science and AI good for X? You will find it's great for everything, because none of this work is getting into the literature. And so, any attempt to accumulate your evidence is going to be massively biased. So I'm by training, a clinical trials statistician. And in one of my formative years, I went to a talk by Ian Chalmers in Cardiff. And his talk was entitled, "The Scandalous Failure of the Medical Community to Accumulate Science Scientifically." Right, so this was his idea. And he was espousing the benefits of meta-analysis. Now, I'm a clinical trial statistician. The first time meta-analysis was explained to me, I thought it was the worst idea in the world, the worst idea I had ever heard. So a clinical trial takes about 5 years. hundreds of meetings, thousands of decisions. You report your results at the end, and you have, for a continuous outcome, you have 6 numbers. Treatment effect in the control arm, standard deviation, sample size, and the same in the experimental group. 6 numbers summarizing all of your 5 years of work. That's reductive enough, right? That's pretty bad. But then what you might do is you might try and find another randomized control trial and stick their 6 numbers together with your 6 numbers and keep on doing that and see what you get. And I thought, this is horrible. This is a terrible, terrible idea. Until Ian Chalmers presented this finding, which was in the Dr. Spock childcare book from the 1970s about advice on how your baby should sleep. On the front or on the back, I can never remember which is the right one. But basically, this advice continued to be given in this published textbook for 30 years after we knew the correct answer. So the meta-analysis converges away from the point of no effect after about 3 studies. And then additional studies keep on happening. Babies randomized to sleeping in dangerous positions. We knew it was harmful, waste of taxpayers' money, and 10,000 infant excess deaths in the UK alone. So we can't fail to do meta-analysis. It's a terrible idea, but it's worse. It's better than the alternative. So I teach meta-analysis at the moment to various different audiences, and I use this as a teaching tool. This is one of the Cochrane reviews, vitamin C for treating the common cold. So okay, have an orange. Is that going to help you with your cold? And this is one of the meta-analyses that I use in training. And so each of these lines here is a study. You have your point estimate, and the whiskers tell you how precise the study is. You mash them all together, and you get a diamond at the bottom. And the width of that diamond indicates the precision. And so I'm going to highlight to you, this is the pointer here, Ritzel, 1961. 139 in the vitamin C group, 140 in the placebo group. So this is table 1 from Ritzel, 1961. This is in the supplementary material from this Cochrane review. Number of study participants, there's 139. Number of placebos, 140. Number of sickness days, that's not the number of colds. Number of individual symptoms, that's not the number of colds. This could be one very sick individual contributing all of this information. And so the data is not in the published paper. So these authors were undeterred. They contacted Ritzel, and Ritzel found his lab book, scanned it, sent it back. This forms the evidence now for the best available evidence for vitamin C for colds. I'm going to zoom in. This is, so it's ambiguous. I think the study was done in 1961. This is from 1971. Shout out to Linus Pauling here. And this is Ritzel. There's 139. There's the placebo. The number of colds, 17 and 31. This was published in 2013, this systematic review. So they went back to Ritzel and asked about his study from 50 years previously. And Ritzel dug out his lab book, found the relevant data, and these people, these are under severe stress. This is about people exposed to severe physical stress or cold. Their information now contributes to the best available evidence on vitamin C for cold, and that is beautiful. Isn't that wonderful? Now, the question to all of us is, if somebody comes to you in 50 years' time and asks you for some additional piece of information that wasn't in your published work, what sort of chance do you think you'll have of being as amazing as Ritzel? And I can tell you, for me, it's 0. And I think that's a real problem that we are going to be tackling. Okay, so I've convinced you. Lack of reproducibility is bad. This is a case study in reproducibility. I'm not going to show you reproducibility can be good. This is my own work. This is me and my daughter. We attempted this. And this is kind of, broadly speaking, the issue. So I run a master's program, a conversion course in data science. And it's a big course. We have over 100 students. They all need a summer project. 4 months, full-time summer project. I'm not writing 100 project specifications. So one of the things that I do is I say to students, go and find a paper that's interesting to you with open data and open code, and conduct a reproducibility study on that paper. Now, in my institution, work of publishable quality gets a student 70%. So if a student is reproducing a published paper, that is de facto of publishable quality, and so it's good for the student, it's good for science, and it means that I'm not writing 100 project specifications. You can have that idea for free. So Omnia it did one of these last year with me. She chose a paper, The Impact of Community Masking for COVID. And this paper is incredible. I'm going to highlight to you the date this was published. 2nd of December 2021. First lockdown in the UK was March 2020. They conceptualized, funded, ran, reported, published all of this within a year and a half. An incredible endeavor. They made their data and their code open. I am in absolute awe of these authors. And they found that masking for COVID did reduce the transmission of COVID by about 11%. Relatively modest, but the adherence wasn't 100%. They went to lots of different Bangladeshi villages. Half of them received masks and advice to mask, and there was community participation. They went to the elders, and they had champions within each village. So that's all well and good. That's fantastic. That all reproduced very, very well, except for issues with seed corn, so with set seed, that kind of thing, when they were using MCNC methods. But they had a second question. They wanted to reduce the transmission of symptomatic respiratory infections as well. And in their rush to publish the COVID findings, which I'm very grateful for, they didn't do the symptomatic respiratory infections, which we can think of as flu. Right? So they have some information on flu. This is the code. And you can see they started coding up the flu-like illness, but they never got around to actually analyzing it. And Omnia analyzed it. She was able to identify that was the plan. They got halfway, and she continued. And using their same method, she found that the masking in these villages reduced flu by about 6%. That's the intervention prevalence ratio. So 1 would mean no effect, so it's about 6.3%. And it was split by surgical masks and cloth masks. You can see the effect attenuates a little bit for the lower quality masks. I'm going to highlight to you 572 villages. That's the total. That shouldn't be there. 300,000 people partook in this study. So Omnia, for her master's, got to analyze a very important secondary outcome from a $3 million trial. That's pretty good. We're in talks now at the moment with the authors to publish this. And I think it's just absolutely fantastic. What a boon. Reproducibility is good for everybody. We can pick up each other's mistakes. We can continue each other's work. I do this regularly with students. They always come up with additional research questions that the authors maybe didn't have time to do or had less interest in. And it's wonderful. I'm a full convert of reproducibility studies for students. Okay, I promised you a solution. And I presented this to the CEO of UKRI last week. And she was interested, but I think she highlighted that this is not the full solution. So I'm going to put that disclaimer out there. This is part of a suite of things that I think institutions need to do. I don't think it solves all of our issues. So I'm an incremental scientist. The point of this slide is I wanted to find a ridiculous catwalk picture and show how it translates into high street fashion. And so we have our trailblazers. I mean, it doesn't quite work. I'd probably wear that. But the trailblazers wear this kind of thing. And then that translates for the rest of us humble researchers into this kind of thing. And I want to be an incremental scientist. I want to improve everybody's behavior a little bit, rather than be the stellar person who's going to make the massive breakthrough. I think the cumulative effects of that are much greater. And so this is part of what this might be about. The idea comes from the Sainsbury lab in Cambridge. They work on plants. Here they are, bothering a plant. And what they do is they have a 3-3-3. They select 3 PIs in their lab. They select 3 of their preprints or publications and 3 tables or figures from each of those. In a random spot check for reproducibility, they must demonstrate the reproducibility of those findings to an external assessor. I mean, external in some sense. It's restricted to original data. This is all well and good when you are dealing with plants. They don't have consent issues, there's no confidential data. Typically, it's one lab. You know everybody in your lab. You have complete enumeration. We want to roll this out at scale across the university, across all departments. all disciplines and see if we can do some kind of reproducibility check. And we're going to select, again, randomly. We're going to take a pharma approach that the most important finding is the one that you check the most. So we're not checking the third appendix in the published work. We're going to look at quantitative claims in abstracts, see if those are reproducible in some sense. It's going to be a very supportive process. We've been very careful to take out all of the punitive language. We're starting with the belief that everybody wants to do good science, everybody wants to do the right thing. And so what we want to do is to show people how they could do things better, because I think that is the current state. I think people do actually want to do the right thing. And it's also perspective. We had lots of anxiety that we'd be trawling through people's papers from 20 years ago, and we're saying, no, this is current, it's in the last 3 months. You're not going to have to contact that grad student who's emigrated, and it's none of those issues. So we have a team. You'll recognize Omnia. Omnia's back on the case. And so she's going to be helping me do some of this work. We've selected clinical and biomedical sciences, and that's a big department. We have this number of publications. Economics, slightly fewer, and the humanities and social sciences. And so what reproducibility means in each of those settings is massively different. I mean, I think we are already seeing these kinds of differences. This will all complete by the end of July, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to make some recommendations for a full rollout. Okay, my final thoughts for you. The more you delve into reproducibility and computational reproducibility, I have a colleague who's interested in bitwise reproducibility. So every single bit produces down to the ones and zeros. That's what he cares about, and it's astonishingly difficult. I think that what the real benefit of reproducibility is that when you are making your work open, it forces you to triple check where you would previously have double checked, or quadruple checked where you'd previously have triple checked. That's the tide that gets risen, and that's the benefit of reproducibility and making work open. And finally, it's very easy to forget when you get into promotion and you've got mouths to feed and you're getting a salary. But at the start, when we all started in science, if somebody pointed out a mistake, you would probably have been grateful. You would have felt, I didn't want to make a mistake in my science. And so it can be quite easy to forget that. And it's just a reminder, none of us are there, right? None of us are, if somebody points out a fatal error in our work, destroying our life's ambition, nobody's feeling gratitude. Everyone is feeling grief. But it's a nice target to aim at. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Next up, we have Xiao Liu, who's a senior clinical scientist at the University of Birmingham. She's deputy editor of the new journal, the New England Journal of AI, and vice chair of the WHO focus group on clinical evaluation of AI in health, as well as the MHRA, that's the UK regulator on AI as software as a medical device. Xiao's made fundamental advancements in the reporting guidelines around AI as a tool in medical sciences, and welcome to her.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. So I think the main bit of context I want to give first is I felt very much on the translational end, speaking to everybody in the room here today. So I'm a clinician by background, and I'm quite far removed in my focus from the methods and foundational end of the scientific sort of endeavor. What really matters to me and my group's work is those technologies that end up being used in patients and affect their lives. And so a lot of what I'll say will be with that lens. So I'm based at the University of Birmingham, where I co-lead a group that works at the intersection of policy, regulation, and science. And what we try and do is partner up and work with various parts of the ecosystem to make sure that the most current scientific practice is being reviewed and translated into effective policy, and treading that really careful line of not slowing down innovation where it might be helpful, but also not compromising on safety, and prioritizing safety, clinical effectiveness, and equity in that journey. So just a bit of context as to where we are in healthcare. I might use the term AI as medical device quite a lot, which, as I've been chatting to people, causes a bit of confusion because device sounds like a physical device. It's a taxonomy thing. It's a problem, but, well, it's not a problem, but we all get confused by it. This comes from the fact that medical devices, those that qualify as medical devices, are ones that influence care, that drive diagnosis, clinical decisions, and so on. And a lot of the rules that apply to AI in healthcare comes from physical medical devices, so things like syringes, surgical equipment, and there's therapeutics as well, and drugs and so on. Within that, there's software as medical device, and then underneath that, there's AI as medical device. So where are we at? FDA has cleared over 800 devices. They update their list regularly. The last time it was updated was about a month or two ago. I think the exact number is 882 medical devices. In Europe and the UK, we don't have good databases for this, but it's probably in the hundreds as well. The Royal College of Radiologists in the UK has recently started curating a list of what is actually being used in the National Health System. And we have about 44 imaging products, so radiology products being used in the NHS. So it's quite a big delta between those two numbers. Just because these devices are cleared by regulators doesn't necessarily mean that they are being used, and there's lots of different reasons for that. There's also a bunch of direct-to-consumer software which are in the health space. So, for example, in 2023, there were, I think, 300-odd million health app users. And that's a whole other area when we think about safety and regulation, because often there's no oversight, there's no, these aren't all necessarily regulated software. So there's often direct-to-patient, direct-to-public health interventions that fall into that category as well, which doesn't necessarily have third-party validation and evidence behind it. So in terms of how my group works, we try and look across this entire innovation pipeline from a proof of concept to solve a clinical problem through to the clinical evaluation, validation to show that this thing works, getting regulatory approval, and through to implementation and thereafter. So really, it's a kind of a cycle towards the end of this pathway. And we try and work with all the stakeholders along that chain, because each of them have a role to play in terms of gatekeeping. And in healthcare, we are in some ways very fortunate that we have multiple gatekeepers along this chain that we can work with. So we can work with regulators to make sure that things have a robust safety threshold. We can work with journal editors to make sure that the evidence behind whether it works or not, whether it's effective or not, is, again, robust, it's transparent, it's reproducible. And in healthcare, reproducibility means what you're showing in your study or your clinical trial can be reproduced in the clinic, in the hospital, and in the lives of patients. We also work a lot with implementers. So once we talked about the generalizability myth, the generalizability gap, we do see real examples of products that have good evidence in validation studies, then really dropping the AUC or dropping their accuracy when they are actually deployed. And sometimes to different extents when they're deployed in multiple hospitals, which is obviously a problem. And some of the work that my group has done over the last few years has been things like initiatives to improve standards for data transparency, reporting guidelines. So these are the two that I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute. But also working directly with our health commissioner, NICE, that sets the standards for digital health technologies and the evidence behind them. Working directly with government, with regulators on reports that highlight issues of bias and issues of safety. And also constructing frameworks that can be adapted in various different ways by implementers as well. For example, the medical algorithmic audit, which is built upon work that's been done by others, Deb Raji, the algorithmic audit. And in some ways, it's kind of dotted across different parts of the ecosystem, but it creates this kind of coherence of approach across different stakeholders. So my own journey into this area was in fact a meta-analysis. So I got interested in diagnostic accuracy of AI during my PhD in 2017, 2018 time, and wanted to look across the board at the diagnostic accuracy of deep learning because they were all being published in the best journals and it was all very impressive and the newspapers were all talking about it. So I set out with a friend, Livia Fez, to do a meta-analysis of deep learning in medical imaging applications across all different specialties. So we were looking at things like diagnosis of pneumonia on chest x-rays, diagnosis of fractures on bone x-rays, lung cancer on CTs, a whole range of different things. And the biggest finding in all of this was that actually we looked at, I think we picked up over 20,000 studies. And if we really applied robust methodology in terms of comparable studies with good benchmarks, with external validation, in clinically relevant tasks, we got to a tiny number of studies that actually met that quality criteria where we could trust the findings. And in those small studies, so if we take the 25 number, which is the studies that actually did external validation on a data set outside of the training data set, only 25 was the number of studies that we could look at, and the performance was equivalent to clinicians or better. So it was kind of good news, but it was also very limited good news. And we also found a whole bunch of reporting issues. So lots of the studies at that time weren't really talking about describing the population, all very clinically relevant information, the inclusion and exclusion criteria within the data sets, where the data sets came from. There was lots of ambiguity around how the data was split. So these things we don't see so much of now, but in 2018 we're seeing a lot of. And also just not many prospective studies at all. Mainly kind of retrospective data set studies. And when we published this meta-analysis, it was really interesting to see how the lay media picked it up. So this, at the time, this was kind of like the first big across-the-board healthcare review of how well AI was doing. And the headlines were all very positive. They didn't really pick up on the main finding, and including my favorite one, yes, we scan. Computers can be better at doctors. And I think that's just an interesting narrative that follows us throughout every wave of AI hype, right? Is that the lay media portrays it in a very sensationalized way, which doesn't help, particularly in dialogues with patients and the public. So in terms of then, what are we aiming for with the evidence gap? I think we're all in agreement in this room. But I really like this quote from ICMJ, which is that in return for the altruism and trust that it takes to make clinical research possible, the research enterprise has an obligation to conduct research ethically and to report it honestly. And that involves having a good question, for a question that is geared towards a clinical need and a gap, a good, robust study design with adequate methods. But the bit that we're kind of going to concentrate on next, which is good reporting, in that it's truthful, it can be reproducible, and also really crucially understandable to the audience too. And so within medical research, we have this great thing called the Equator Network, which is a sort of international collaborative to improve the quality of research reporting. And this has been in place for many years, for as long as we've been doing randomized trials. We've had the consort guidelines, which mandates things like specifying how you randomize, for example, what your randomization procedures are, how you do blinding, how you analyze the different arms of your trial, things like that. It specifies that they're essentially like checklists which specify the minimum content needed when you're reporting your study and you're going ahead and publishing it. It doesn't tell you what to do with your methods. It just tells you to please tell us what you did. And the byproduct of that is when you have to be really honest and clear and open about what you did, it kind of makes you think about, maybe I should do it in a certain way. So whilst it doesn't set out to guide methods, it kind of inadvertently ends up doing so anyway. But the main purpose of all of these guidelines is that it puts the authors, the peer reviewers, and the editors on a level playing field when reviewing scientific work. And we definitely had a period of a year and a half, maybe 2 years, where peer reviewers and editors and authors were not on a level playing field. It was very difficult to find peer reviewers that could critique these elements. And we know that because the editors have told us so. So in 2019, we set out to extend the consort reporting guidelines for AI considerations. And we added a number of elements, including things like description of human-computer interaction, description of the input data in a way that you can actually replicate it, description of how you manage the outputs of the algorithm, how it leads to a human decision, elements like that. Talking about things like version of algorithms, giving it unique identifiers. And some of these elements were about transparency, and some were about supporting the rest of the ecosystem. So for example, adding a unique device identifier, which is something that we have for medical devices, which allows regulators to trace them, and also so that when you then come to deploy something like that in clinical practice, you know it's the same one that appeared in that paper and not something that's been iterated on since. Things like that to support the rest of the ecosystem. And in 2020, we had these guidelines published in 3 journals simultaneously. So this is kind of a special thing. And they all knew, by the way, it wasn't like a secret. But it was kind of almost like an indicator of solidarity in the publishing community that this is something that we really want to do as a community. And so now, if you submit, for example, to Lancet Digital Health, which is probably one of our leading journals for digital health things, you have to supply the checklist alongside your paper, and you have to indicate which page each of these elements appear on. And your peer reviewers can check that, and your editors can check it. And since then, there have been a number of other reporting guidelines, there's a part of me that's kind of like, we're adding to the number of guidelines, and there are many, many guidelines. But each of these do serve a specific purpose in terms of study design, because the things you might have to report in a validation study will be very different to what you need to report in a randomized trial. And so there are now a number of these. The most recent one is Tripod Plus AI, and I think that is referenced in our booklets there. Tripod Plus AI is a very comprehensive guideline on prediction models, so development and validation of prediction models. And one of my favorite papers is actually the guidance document that accompanies Tripod Plus AI, which is just like hugely educational and very helpful. So that's reporting guidelines, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit now to talk about something that I've been working on for the last 2 years, which is tackling this issue of bias within data sets and algorithms. And this is really with the lens of avoiding exacerbation of existing health inequalities. So we know that AI can reflect on biases that are within the data, and that there's lots of scientific work showing that that can lead to things like underperformance of algorithms in demographic subgroups. Often these tend to be minoritized and already underserved groups. And we do see this translating through to actual unfair practice too. So there are multiple lawsuits going on in the US with insurers at the moment about unfair denial of care for patients. And the Guardian article is actually of a tool called Babylon Health, which was an app that was used in the UK for a while for triaging sort of primary care symptoms and things like that, misdiagnosing women's symptoms of a myocardial infarction, heart attack, as anxiety. So caveat is that humans do this too, but human clinicians don't operate in complete isolation, and they can only really hurt one patient at a time. So it is slightly different, but I just want to put that caveat in there to avoid AI exceptionalism. We know that bias can arise in many different parts of the AI lifecycle, and I just want to call out that this project was specifically focusing on the data, but it's not the only source of bias. And just to show what we found so far. So we did a series of data mapping exercises across different disease contexts. So we looked at COVID-19, skin cancer data sets, ophthalmology, and the other ones shown here. And what we find is that there's huge disparity and patchiness in terms of where the data comes from around the world, But perhaps more importantly, the documentation of really important characteristics like race and ethnicity, age, sex is really poor. And that also includes things that are clinically relevant. So for example, in skin cancer, it's important to know the color of the skin when you're thinking about diseases like melanoma, different prevalences. And we found that less than 10%, sorry, this was for ethnicity, so I think it was less than 5% reported skin color in their data sets. And you cannot assess for algorithmic bias if you do not have that information, so we can't do those tests. So we highlighted this issue of data gaps, but then there's also documentation gaps, which then visibilize the problem. I'm going to start going a bit quicker just for time. So Standing Together was an international consensus effort to build standards around data documentation and handling of biases in AI's medical device. We engaged over 350 contributors from 58 countries, from a bunch of different stakeholder groups, and have produced a set of standards which are they're not published yet, but they're accessible in an abbreviated form at datadiversity.org. And it comes in two parts. So the first part is around what is the minimum documentation requirements for a data set so that we can visibilize potential limitations. And the goal of this is so that someone who's seeking to use a data set to create an innovation or to derive some sort of health insight can make sound judgments around what is this data set suitable for my question and what are the limitations and assumptions behind that. And then there's part two, which is around when you use that data set to create something that's going to be used in health, it includes some recommendations around how you should evaluate that. Specifically around, one, contextualizing it for potential biases that are important in that clinical use case, and then secondly, to evaluate it in subgroups, which currently for medical devices, we don't have to do. So you can have an aggregate population, show that you have a good performance. You don't have to look for biases within that to be on the market. I'll skip over these slides. And just the last one is just to mention how we have, how this is integrated into regulation policy. The MHRA, which is a UK regulator, has specifically referenced Standing Together in their standards development work package of software and AI's medical device. 2 weeks ago, it was called out at G20, which was pretty cool. Unbeknownst to us, we don't know who called it out, but that was nice. And it was also referenced at the AI Safety Summit last year. We're now looking to see if we can translate these into auditable standards with ISO and BSI. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiao. Our final speaker in the session is Rebecca Lawrence. She's Managing Director of F1000, which she set up and launched in 2013. Rebecca is Vice Chair of DORA, which is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, and is a member of the European Commission's Open Science Policy Platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here and part of this important discussion. So, I wanted to talk about the opportunities of AI in improving and maintaining the trust and integrity of the scientific record, which obviously feeds into many of the tools that we've been talking about. I was going to start with taking you through this published scenario. It's a hypothetical scenario, but as you will see as we go through it, actually highly plausible and will lead into many of the comments that I make later. So in this scenario, we encounter Professor Eve, distinguished medical doctor, but has limited knowledge of genomics. He's delving into intricacies of breast cancer research using AI-generated content, using a large language model, embarks on a comprehensive literature review to explore the genetic variants associated with breast cancer. The model gives him a list of what seemingly are relevant genetic variants linked to breast cancer. Critically, though, he doesn't seek counsel from a genomics expert or conducts further validation, but incorporates those AI-generated findings into his research paper. Now, I know we all know in this room, absolutely it's critical to go and seek that expert guidance, but we also know that an awful lot of research is under huge amount of time pressure and pressure to publish quickly and get things out. And so this is something that I think can happen very easily with many groups. Unknown to him, the training model sitting behind that, training data sitting behind that AI model is incomplete, as well as having some potentially biased information in there about genetic variants. So it leads to inclusion of inaccurate and misleading details about the relationship between breast cancer and genetics in his paper. Forward through, it's published, forward through, it's submitted, it goes through the peer review process. And now the peer reviewers, as we're increasingly finding, are relying on large language models to conduct the peer review. And of course, because it's a similar model that they may be using, reach the same erroneous conclusions, and it flies through peer review and is then published. Now, as we all do, esteemed professor, we think, okay, we trust, his findings, and so readers might then inadvertently accept those flawed findings, potentially steering researchers into misleading and misguided avenues. But adding complexity, one of those genetic variants has since been disproved, and now this oversight, stemming from that lack of genomics expertise and his failure to perform the due diligence, actually has the potential to cast doubt on all of the credibility of all of his research, which can have far-reaching consequences in itself. At the same time, it can, the ramifications of those inaccuracies can actually impact other academics and scientists, leading to misallocation of funding and of valuable research time, based on those conclusions, and of course, particularly given the context here, it can directly affect patients and the treatment that are affected. So as I say, it is a hypothetical scenario, but actually I don't think so hypothetical. There's a growing, as you're probably aware, range of issues around verification of research. F1000 is an open research publisher, but we're part of Taylor and Francis, which is one of the top 4 publishers. That graph on the left is similar across all the big publishers, but it shows the enormous growth of cases that come through to the research integrity team. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is caught ideally before publication, but some of it will get through. And the graph at the bottom shows that whilst still plagiarism and authorship concerns remain a percentage of that growth really is driven by data integrity issues, image integrity issues. And there is a plethora of different problems sitting behind this, all the way from outright fraud down to, as we've heard a lot about already, replication crisis and a whole raft of different things that sit behind that. And as we know, there's a huge number of different things that go into misconduct, ranging from unintentional, often just poor laboratory research practice one way or another, all the way through to intentional fraud. I'm not going to go through all of these, clearly, but there are a number of them that I think are particularly important and relevant here. Increasingly, of course, we're seeing the use, or rather I should probably say misuse, of generative AI tools by all stakeholders, by authors, by reviewers. We're seeing a whole raft of issues around data sharing. That's if it's shared in the first place, but if it is, there are issues around what is shared in some cases. We've heard quite a bit about inadequate and biased reporting of research, around biased decision-making, either by the researchers, maybe selective reporting, or indeed in the peer review process. And then at the far end, fake data, image manipulation, we're seeing a lot of. We've heard about p-hacking and data massaging, and then outright nonsensical and fraudulent content, sometimes at cartel scale. So obviously this is a concern not only in terms of the outputs that come out of the research that we're doing, but particularly I think about the inputs that we're training some of these data sets on, and there is a whole raft of potential issues that are sitting in that content. It's not all doom and gloom. I think there's a number of things that we can do about it, a number of things that AI can help us do about this. So of course AI is already being used, in fact, by most publishers to help support verification of content. So most obviously looking at content similarity, for example, or looking at image manipulation, those kind of things, or spotting misalignments between citations and the content. It's also being used to look at detecting journal patterns, so particularly Clarivate and Web of Science, or the Chinese Academy of Science grey lists, look at odd patterns of citation, for example, or strange activity that you can see at a sort of journal level scale that give you an indication there were some issues in the content. I think it was referenced yesterday, actually, by one of the tables. There is an opportunity that AI can help to level the playing field in terms of language. We know it can take an awful lot longer for somebody whose first language is not English to write an article in English. And actually, if we can help using AI to support translation and language editing and polishing, we can level that playing field. However, I think there probably needs to be much greater awareness of the use of certain services that may have lower data standards or confidentiality standards in there, that often if you put your article in there, it can be incorporated into the language model. And in doing so, it may be that the article, which of course is not published at this point, because you probably haven't even submitted it, may also have some information in there that shouldn't be being shared more publicly and is now incorporated in the model. So there's something I think we need to make sure authors are aware of. And then, of course, we need better AI tools to spot undeclared AI and LLM use in manuscripts and in peer review. There is a lot of work going on towards this, but at the moment they're not really very effective at spotting this. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking, from talking to a lot of you who have, commented that most of your teams do use these tools and researchers, but often don't want to declare it because they think they shouldn't be. I think we maybe want to get to a point where we actually make it clear to our researchers it's fine to use it, but we need to declare it, because then it opens the conversation rather than not telling us in the first place, but we kind of know it's what's being used. In terms of guidelines around AI use when it comes to publication, in the sort of rush for all the publishers to put out guidelines as to what isn't okay around authorship and inclusion of AI in publications, of course, it's had a sort of plethora of different guidelines, which adds confusion. So there is some work going on. There's something called the ISTIC Blue Book, which is being developed at the moment, together with Committee of Publishing Ethics and ICGME and many others, to come up with some consistent guidelines. But as part of that, there's some really interesting and I think important elements in there around best practices that I think we all collectively need to support and train researchers around in terms of when they're using AI tools, what they need to do to support and maintain that integrity and transparency and reproducibility. So, for example, checking the reliability of the content themselves that's come out of the models, verifying references, making sure only valid and unbiased material is being included, and making sure particularly that there isn't false, biased or discriminatory information in there, making sure that it's human-led decisions involved in identifying concepts, verifying the statistical methods and seeking guidance from experts, to my point at the beginning in that hypothetical example, making sure images are real images and not AI generated, if they are, making it clear, and ultimately, standing behind the reporting of the ideas and the methods, etc., that are in there. AI, of course, as we've heard, can also be used as an enabler of reproducibility in publication. Cochrane's been mentioned a couple of times now in terms of systematic reviews, but one of the things that they're looking at, because it's such an enormous task to put together a systematic review, to do the analysis, to find all the information comes out of that and figure out which ones to include and not, and then do the meta-analysis. Of course, clinical guidelines and policies are based on these, and invariably are therefore a couple of years out of date because it takes so long to do this. So one of the things that the Cochrane teams are doing is looking at, can we automate that analysis of the literature to extract the relevant information to support the meta-analysis. Now, obviously, it's essential that this is accurate because it is going to influence clinical policy, but it's also because the need for human checking throughout it to make sure that it does have enough of a workload reduction. And so that's the process and analysis that they're looking at the moment, which will obviously lead to guidelines about appropriate use and when and how to use it. As already been mentioned, there is an opportunity here, I think, to rebalance the literature to enable the publishing of all outputs. One of the hurdles to publishing the negative and null findings is just the burden of putting all of that together and publishing it. There's an opportunity here to support these workflows in publishing all the different outputs and make sure that we have a full, less biased understanding, and equally to support fair sharing of data and code and workflows, and potentially directly connect workflows into article production. And I'm going to show an example here that we're working on at the moment with the Wellcome Sanger Centre based in Cambridge in the UK, called the Tree of Life. So they are sequencing 70,000 genomes, and they're aiming to provide a global resource, not just for researchers, but for the broader community and society. And they wanted to add genome notes to each of these to help promote discovery and make it easier to interpret and use these. And of course, given the scale, but also given how highly structured these sequences are and the information required associated, we are developing an automated submission and validation route. So essentially the way that works is as they're doing they do the genome sequence, of course, but as they do that, they capture a lot of the methods, information and data and automatically create a genome note, which is created in XML immediately, so there's no need to do all the normal typesetting, etc. And at the same time, they create essentially a set of key metrics, a sort of report essentially around different aspects of genome continuity, base accuracy, etc. And that also comes over to us as XML. And we will then do a quick check, and that enables us to publish that straight away. So you've already got almost automated publishing that this will create. As part of that, of course, you've got that metrics report. Now that essentially is a peer review report. So now you can start to say, well, actually, we only really need one human that can then look at it, that's an expert in sequencing and in that particular species, that then forms the other peer review. So you can see it starts to change the way that we can publish and make it far more efficient. So I'm just going to finish with 4 key things that I think are really important for us to do to really help support the effective use of AI in research. The first one we just heard in the last talk, actually, a number of some good progress around thinking about reporting standards for AI use to support accountability and transparency and to support the work of the peer reviewers. Because if it's a black box, it's going to be incredibly difficult, as Victoria pointed out right at the beginning, for us to understand and for the reviewers to do an adequate assessment on those articles. Of course, we're going to need, just as we with clinical trials, other articles have statistical reviewers, we're going to need specific reviewers who have expert knowledge in how models work and specific questions to help support that adequate analysis of what's gone into that study and therefore the reliability of the conclusions. I think we need to develop trust markers, back to my point at the beginning, and the real challenges around the integrity of the content that's being published, that's then being fed in. I don't know how much in terms of when things are retracted in the literature, whether that's also fed into these models, but we've got a real challenge around that. So one of the things that we're working on, together with a whole series of other publishers and other entities, and parts of the community, is trust markers on the content. So you've got some idea of what's been checked, what's passed, what hasn't passed. Because all publications, you've got preprints in there as well, all checked in different ways, in different places. And as a reader, you really have no idea what you're looking at. And then finally, we need to really reform research assessment to incentivise the sharing of the null and the negative findings, so that we rebalance the literature, to incentivise sharing and development of fair and responsible, good quality data and code and reproducible results. I think as part of that, and actually this is something that Demoteline Liza, the CEO of UKRI, talks about quite a bit, but I think is really important, is move to a funding system that better supports researchers in doing less but better, so that they have the time to actually put out the good quality results, powered enough with adequately curated data. Obviously, we need to shift away from the publish and perish culture so that we don't just accelerate the rate at which we publish more and more findings, but not very good quality findings that are then going to feed even further into the models that we've got. And we need to incentivize team science and multidisciplinary teams. We've heard the sort of growing breadth of different type of parties working in those teams. And we need to make sure they're adequately rewarded and incentivized. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we have our panel discussion. So if I can invite all of the speakers up to the stage. We're running a little bit behind, so I suggest we claw a bit of time back but start the breakout groups no later than 10:50. So. Okay, first question from the back.
So I wanted to ask.
It's not on, I don't think.
I wanted to ask, especially Victoria, you kind of had a full-throated argument for changing the scientific model, and I was less convinced on like what makes what you talked about different than, say, simulation. Simulation has many steps. You can't really interrogate. You can experiment on simulation, but you can't really interrogate the steps. We can't follow the trillion steps of an MD, very long MD simulation. All of the arguments seem to apply just as well. I thought the only thing that's really, really different is if we're interacting with hosted models and we can't guarantee that we can have access to the same version of a hosted service as we had before. Like, okay, that's different, but in what extent is this really different, or we're just operating a software tool, but we feel it's different because we've never had software tools that operate on English in a deep way?
So, okay, let me summarize. Leveraging foundation models akin to simulation. I don't know if I necessarily buy that. And then there's also this question that pops to mind. If all these questions have attended to simulation over decades that we've been relying on this work, why haven't these questions kind of come up before? And the best guess that I have is that there's a lot of care around validation, right? And there's a lot of structure about verification and validation, uncertainty quantification in simulation. A separate conversation whether that rises to the standards that we're talking about here, but those are at play. Now, do those solutions that are implemented in that field immediately carry over to, say, for example, the talks that we saw yesterday? I'd have to think it through, right? I don't know. It's not immediately obvious, right, that it's the same.
My quick comment is they should. That in fact, maybe what it is that we're failing to apply, say, the standards of validation for simulation that we know is, all models are wrong, but some is useful, this famous comment of George Box.
That's far beyond simulation. That's essentially every time we're doing modeling.
Yeah, we should validate better, but I don't think it breaks science, in my view.
We had a question here next. And then
yes, I have a question. It's mostly to you, but to the general panel. So what I feel is that the way we look at it is probably a little bit misleading, because when we do, for example, physics experiments, the assumption is, I really like the Bacon quotes, the Bacon squared quotes. If we do physics, there is this implicit assumption that the physics is the same for everyone. And therefore there is a ground truth that we perceive through a noisy lens, but essentially it's the same thing. When you do simulations on these things, the physics changes, and it essentially depends on if you have one simulator, the other simulator, third climate simulator, there is no ground truth anymore. And I do think that that's the first problem that I would like you to address. What is kind of then the ground truth? When we do medical experiments, the problem is it's similar to that, because the whole thing with the bias has to do with the fact that if I do medical experiments in India and in the US, again, it's not the same ground truth. It's a different people, different genetic makeup, etc. And the other thing is, and I think that's also linked to that, when you do experiments, it's something very weird when we think, I'm a physicist, so I'm obviously thinking about relatively clean laws that we try to isolate with very complicated and messy engineering. When we do engineering, it's the opposite. We mess up the physics in such a way that the outcomes of what we do is reliable. Laptops, very complicated physics in semiconductors, but very reliable outcomes. I do think that the problem is really that when data messy, we have a far more fundamental issue with creating reliable links to what's going on. So and the problem is it's a runaway process. So that's what I wonder. When we start doing experiments on simulated things, we can go as far away from reality as we want. My question to you is, what do we do to ground it?
Yeah. Let's do the first one first, then the idea of ground truth.
Well, so in many sort of the traditional, I'm not a physicist, so I'm going to talk about physics and probably make mistakes, so I'll just put that out there. But many times what you are trying to understand is, or verify, is some mathematical equation. This is not the case in all types of research. For example, in your medical example, you may be trying to uncover patterns that you see in people's behaviors. I mean, maybe it's a conjecture. Maybe there is some mathematical equation underlying it all, but that's not quite as clear as it is in, say, for example, physics simulations, bomb simulation, whatever it is, nuke degradation, whatever it is that you're simulating. So that's where I think some of this idea of validation, like looking at what do I kind of have a sense from, say, for example, the physics models that I know that I would expect from a good simulation. If you know that, you're streets ahead. Right, and in many types of analysis, for example, some of the ones we talked about yesterday, or maybe simulation that might be people or something that's not as grounded in some physical equations, then you're in a situation where you don't have that same ability to say, well, here's what a good simulation, here's what I would look for if I wanted to know this was correct. Right, and so you have to sort of think about, like I was trying to say in my talk, well, what are the benchmarks? What's a well-constructed solution? Right, and I do think the characteristics and the nature of the problem itself that you're trying to answer will guide that a lot. It's certainly not. I mean, my talk was at a high level, but I certainly wasn't trying to lump all different approaches into one.
And can I just open up to other panelists if they any comments or thoughts on ground truth?
I mean, the area that I work in, ground truth is almost always unreliable because medical knowledge is so limited. In fact, often the areas of most opportunity in medicine is the ones where the ground truth is least good. So, like, my PhD was around trying to count floating inflammatory cells in the eye through a beam of light, which you get the same clinician doing that in the morning and the afternoon, and they'll give you different counts. And so our approach to ground truth has always been through an expert consensus. So we get a panel of specialists, retinal physicians who are at the top of their game diagnostically, and you still get heterogeneity within their ground truth. But I mean, taking a very practical lens, again, I come back to what's useful for patients. Even in the absence of a clean ground truth, you can still make something that's really useful applied and can still benefit outcomes. So that's my lens on it, but I realize that's kind of a different discussion.
I'm going to just step in and we'll say let's take the second part of the question into the group discussions, because I can see there's been quite a few hands up before. David next, and then I was aware of you, and then David at the back, and then so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions lined up, David.
I just had a comment on the exchange between John Jumper and Victoria, which is I don't think any of us are particularly worried about the use of these new models in the context of the people in this room. But a key thing about LLMs is the hyper-democratization that they offer, that there's a great expansion of the people who think they can do research by essentially saying, here's a paper, I can load it into one of these LLMs with a giant context length. Now take that paper and rewrite it, but just change a little bit. Now, as soon as you do that, then that means high school students can enter the game, or whatever you think of as being the great unwashed. And so John is, I think, right that it's just a piece of software and we shouldn't fear it in the right hands. But many new entrants are going to be coming in. And I think our last presentation from the context of journals, reading between the lines in everything that was said, what I would feel is there are many people who are operating on research hopium who think they can write research papers and be responsible and so on, but they're not doing it. That's why we have all these fake journals and stuff. So just a comment.
Any reflections on the comment from the panel?
I have just a very quick comment, and thank you, Dave. So I sort of had a joke in my talk that how do you verify some of these research results that come from extremely opaque methods? And the joke was, well, we'll ask an LLM. But in a way, it's not a joke, because I know that if I put that question to my students, however I phrased it, like, is this true? That's exactly what they would do, and go out and ask ChatGPT.
Yeah, and just to your comment, I mean, I think there is so much pressure on getting papers out and producing outputs that researchers are often cutting corners. I think that's, I mean, yes, there are some people at the far end, right? But there's a lot of people cutting corners, and this helps them to cut corners. And I guess the other thing we obviously need to be careful of is that, yes, we all recognize, individuals in the room will do things well. We need to make sure that new entrants may be coming from other parts of the world. We need to make sure we don't make it even less equitable than it was before, because we're even more nervous about those entrants coming into it. So it's not an easy problem, clearly.
I'm just going to follow up. So you said that you had some evidence that reviewers were using AI to conduct reviews. Why? Like, why are they not just refusing the review?
Because they don't want to read the paper.
You get rewarded.
They want reward for having done it. They want to look good to the editor or whatever, but
They waited until
they
the last
don't
minute.
think we'll be able to tell.
There we go. Next question, please. Yeah.
So it feels like most of the speakers in this session actually focus on the replicability rather than the reproducibility, I feel like. And then in fact, Sasha was the one who actually said that the replicability wasn't enough, because even if the experiments are replicated, maybe some of the things that we want to capture are not really captured. But then I want to push it a bit further in the opposite direction, and then say that do we actually care about the replicability or even the reproducibility as well? Is that there are many different levels at which we care about the reproducibility, as long as the final outcomes or the results are correct. Does it actually matter that we have to be able to precisely replicate? I think one of the speakers even mentioned the replicability at the bit level, right? Does it even matter that we have to care about it, as long as we know that this actual outcome or the results or the conclusion were correct?
Well,
How do you
know
measure
it's
that?
correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Reproducibility is one of our main
tools
tools to say, okay, I believe it's probably correct.
So
Right?
you can imagine that the scientific conclusion stays valid. However, it turned out later on that how they validated was incorrect, but there was another way to validate it that results in the same conclusion. And we wouldn't say that the conclusion was invalid just because the original study followed the protocols that were not perfectly valid to a current standard. And then standard changes, ground truths don't exist in most of the cases. So how much do we actually have to care about it beyond checking the validity of the conclusion alone?
But for example, if the evaluation changes and say, like, you want to say, well, my model is better than someone's model 5 years ago, and you want to use a new benchmark, then you have to be able to run their model. Otherwise, how can you compare? Because they used benchmark from 2022, and you're in 2024. And so you need to be able to replicate the results. And I think the fact that if we can't do that really makes leaderboards kind of null and void, because they're comparing, for example, some model from 5 years ago to a model now, and they're saying that they're better or worse or whatever. And we can't meaningfully do that. And so for me, it's like now, anytime I read a paper and it's like, we beat previous results, I'm like, I'm not sure that's a meaningful conclusion to make, right? So I think that in order to build upon previous science, you need to replicate previous science, essentially.
Very briefly, Mark.
I so desperately want to not care about bitwise reproducibility, but I think it's like the butterfly effect. You know, a single bit has an error right at the start of your algorithm, and then that has dramatic implications for your final conclusion. You don't know that until you go through that reproducibility process, because it could change the final conclusion, even if it's a tiny error at the start. You just don't know. So I think, sadly, I think we all do have to start thinking about some of those issues. We're not all software engineers, so the tools need to be accessible to all.
At the back, David had his hand up before. Can we have questions very concise and answers concise?
Thanks so much. This might be for Rebecca, Victoria, and Sasha. So it's coming from a kind of philosophy perspective. So in the 20th century philosophy of science, we've made a distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, right? So the context of discovery involved those kind of intuitive moments where we come upon knowledge generation on the basis of, insights that come from new evidence, new models, abductive thinking, that type of thing. Whereas contexts of justification are actually the conditions of rational acceptability, and where we actually have to, give and ask for reasons and justify the results within the broader scientific community. And so I guess my question is, from what you're saying, especially Victoria, are we facing a future where we can no longer make a distinction between context of discovery and context of justification in virtue of how the science is actually being presented? Or do we need to maintain a more rigorous distinction between those two contexts?
That's a complicated question. So my instinct is on the latter, okay? And the reason is because, so a lot of the discussion that we're having is quite abstracted from things like what is the computational infrastructure, the architecture that you're running it on, that inherently has its own sources of error and variability that get injected into the process that we always ignore, right? And that goes beyond setting seeds, it's all like concurrency issues and so on. And so wouldn't that be part of the context, right? Like that's how I did that experiment. And you might want to know, because if you do something similar, in some world that I'm imagining, you'd like to have some idea of what a confidence region means around that, deeply computational result, right? We don't really talk like that yet, but I think we're going there. So I'm not convinced we'll get into a world where we sort of lose that context or the need for a justification or rationalization. I think we will always be in a situation where the idea is that we need to convince the community that this is likely to be true, right, to establish a fact, right? And that goes beyond justification or validation and so on. Those are all tools to actually do this and create this social acceptance of what we believe. So when we are using sort of newer tools and implementations, processes, methods to arrive at these results, it's all the buy-in about what that process is that generated that result. I don't see how that doesn't go to context, and maybe even more deeply so, because so much of it is buried or hidden in some way. It's a guess. I don't know. That's right off the top of my head.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to curtail this session because of interest of time. So I'm aware that we said there were some questions there. Please take them to your meetings now at the tables. So let's thank the speakers. Thanks, everyone. We're now going to ask the conveners to give their comments. And I asked my ChatGPT to randomize the numbers 1 to 5. Yeah. And we will never know if it's reproducible, but it's 1, 3, 2, 4, 5. Is that random? We don't know. But table number 1, 3, first, please.
Okay, that's me. So I'm Peter Stone from UT Austin and Sony AI, a computer scientist. And so at this table we started sort of it was a free-flowing conversation. So I'll try to summarize, but started asking whether if we think of large language models as sort of studying what they're doing as sort of a natural science, then there's analogs to other fields, like psychology, for example, is studying people, but we don't make and we ask the question is whether people change over time. Is that the same as large language models changing over time? If you come and ask the question, can what does Sasha know, for example, and then we ask that same question the next day, it might be different because of she's read the newspaper in between. Is that the same as a bug fix in a large language model, or somebody sort of locking it down to not say the scandalous thing? I think the consensus was that's not the same. And we do have an opportunity to sort of timestamp and say but people should realize that there's the conclusions that are being done in a particular study are version 2.x of this software that was available on this day, and to make it reproducible, that has to remain available and accessible, which is not really the norm right now. Also, if you're asking, if people in human-robot interaction, for example, used to do studies on a single person and realized if you're going to try to make conclusions about how people in general react, you can't do it on your studies on a single person. You'll need to do this on multiple people. But we have to ask these same questions on multiple trained models if we want to ask something about large language models, as opposed to ChatGPT on January 5th, and that we need to. Or hopefully that people will sort of start documenting and saying exactly what they're studying and benchmarking them. There was some bemoaning about field norms of how much effort it takes to create a publication. And that these days in some fields that you can just say here's some prompts I sent in over a day or two, and here's the paper I wrote, and it leads to sort of norms of how many publications are needed before you apply to grad school, or even apply to undergrad these days, and so that's something that but that's not necessarily the point was made, that's not necessarily due to LLMs. That's also just something that was happening in fields beforehand. And then I guess last two points, that there was also a commonality. Many of these things are not necessarily new, though. That in the fact that language models change over time, also measurement devices change over time in physics and in other in other fields, and so the conclusions can be different as a result of that as well. And then we close sort of with the question of whether this the phenomenon we're seeing right now of people over trusting language models in some cases, using them to replace advisors or replace other authorities, or to do evaluations and things. Whether this is transitory, whether people are going to they're going to lose their reputation, and people are going to recognize as they've become accustomed to interacting with them what they're good for and what they're not good for, or whether this is just going to keep happening and people are going to keep having the faith that the latest foibles will get fixed, and we're going to just keep trusting them more and more. There was the point made that in I guess 20 years ago, there was a point of people realized that algorithms had numerical instabilities in them, and that this would lead to sort of different results that were if you tried to reproduce an experiment, and it took people a good deal of time to wrap their heads around that, but then when they did, they started responding more appropriately to it. So I guess the question was, should we be more? Is that going to happen, or with as we gain experience with models over time?
Great, thank you. Table number 3 next.
Thank you, Philip Steer, Oxford Physics. So we talked all about reproducibility. We kicked off with a discussion how to incentivize this, and how do you actually get researchers motivated to do it. There was some disagreement between fields, so this seems to be slightly less developed in computer science than in other areas, where this is really embedded in the thinking. But yeah, that's something maybe to think about, how to translate between different fields. Then we thought, a bit more about the theme. How do you apply reproducibility in fields where the data or compute is really big? And it's just not simple to implement a spot check by a colleague because they don't have the same amount of resources as a project. You would basically have to duplicate all projects. And that's not easy. So the question is then emerges then is if other quality checks can take on some of this role rather than a fully spot check all the way to the bit identical level. And I guess it came up sort of an interesting avenue to pursue could be sort of development of tools that really spot discrepancies between codes or even the methods and the actual data in the paper rather than trying to go through the full pipeline of everything. The question is it key to reproduce things all the way to bit level reproducibility, or do we need high level outcomes potentially? And the high level outcomes are very important, but how do we measure them? So could it be that what counts is the algorithm in a broad sense, but not the code? But again, that sort of is difficult to measure. And in some areas, I guess in climate, that happens already because these codes are big and complex. Ultimately, you replace sort of direct reproducibility with an intercomparison, and you hope that this gives you some sanity check. I think from experience, it doesn't always work. So I think new ideas would be very welcome, particularly from other fields. And then we ended up really on the discussion, do all results need to be actually reproducible, or should we sometimes be brave and throw out some ideas and that are not yet at the level where they might be reproducible, but they're still good ideas, and does it need maybe slightly different publishing avenues or journal categories for more crazy early stage ideas that can later be developed into a system?
Great, thank you. Number 2, table 2.
Okay, so we talked about a few things at our table. We started off thinking about some sort of ideas from computer science, and that there's a concept there that things can be true and obviously true, but very difficult to prove, and the ability to do science via oracles, and that we may be moving towards just having very good oracles that we rely on. We talked about differences between natural science and artificial science, sort of figuring out how things work versus building new tools, and comparing this to engineering versus science in terms of explanation versus predictions and tools. Trying to read all of my notes, sorry. I was madly scribbling as we talked through things. And whether all of science will just become more like engineering in the end. And even if this happens, then we still have some of the issues that were talked about by our speakers in terms of authorship and incentive structures. Talked about understanding versus prediction, why we value explanation and different reasons why we value explanation, that this helps us generalize and improve our predictions. But also sort of a deep human need for understanding. But then we got into talking about, do we really understand, and maybe being a bit more modest about what we mean by understanding, and that we want a grasp of the world, but there are different ways of grasping things, and each of us might have a different view of what that means, I guess. I hope I've summarized that all right. It was a free-flowing discussion, but... Yeah.
Thank you. Table number 4.
So we also had a broad-ranging discussion, but I've categorized it into 4 themes. So first theme was diversity, and particularly the diversity of scientific approaches. So we all had examples of both highly reproduced science at one end of the standard spectrum, but on the other end, we had examples of even very low evidence leading to really good ideas, even falsified evidence leading to good ideas sometimes. And when we think of science broadly, all of those pieces bring some value, possibly, but that value needs to be assessed in the context of what it is. And so we thought there were a lot of pragmatic solutions that would be helpful to kind of help in that process. So checklists for publications were great, particularly ones that were not onerous or were optional. Just reminders that you probably should talk about certain aspects of your data, also very helpful at the publication stage. Code steering, we talked a little bit about how public shaming for code that was obviously very low quality would probably be helpful. And then another pragmatic challenge is, what do we mean by reproducibility? And on one end, the computer science end, bitwise is possible, but on the other end of reproducibility in the human experience, it reminds me of the Zen koan that a swimmer can never swim in the same river twice, because when you go, the water has moved, but also the swimmer has changed. So, those kind of things, reproducibility is different, right? In this more general approach, from this more diverse perspective, then you think that education, particularly education of scientific values, becomes critically important. Things like standards and self-critical thinking, not just critical thinking, but being critical of yourself, self-doubt is a key value that cuts across all of those pieces. And then the last part is, of course, assessment. And so what's exciting about LLMs is that they're a new assessor. They can go and read thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of papers and draw conclusions, which is a potentially fraught process. You also need to balance that with assessment by experts, assessment peer review, and then assessment by the media and assessment by the public are also part of what we need to think about in this broader range of things.
Thank you. And finally, table number 5.
So this is probably the Tales of Being With. This is the one that focused most on the topic, which is reproducibility. The first comment was, we didn't discuss that much of that. The question is, will AI break the current publishing system, and will it have to change? Then there's sort of there's a question of whether you can reproduce a replicability, because the systems may not be robust to minor changes. And apparently some of the chips change depending on the version you have. But then it's being done by, I remember table 1, is for example, in physical experiments, there are many details that are missing. And maybe, I think it was Boyle's thing where you watched and signed was a good thing. Also mentioning that in psychology, there's a issue of replication, what experiments to do, what the people change. The question sort of came to moving the instability of machine learning algorithms and need to accept their end-to-end instabilities in the replication itself. And the other thought was, there's some criticism of papers always in leaderboards, you get performance just slightly above the last one. But in a sense, if you get 5 papers all slightly above it, is that a form of replication itself, that other people can do that solution, and hopefully the details, data training set, and following the rules are followed? This came up to a question, is that when do we retire some older data sets? There are very famous ones that, as they are brilliant in their time, but other flaws have been noted with them. Maybe it's time to retire them. They're still out there for benchmarking older ones, but we need to build data sets that correct the findings of the first one, but we have grown and our knowledge has changed since then. And also the other thing we mentioned, the effect of pulling data for ethical reasons. There's some data sets where copyright or legal issues may be taken care of. There's other data sets where they found the collection violated the IRB rules, and they were pulled for those reasons. And I remember personally recently reviewing a paper and having sent it up the meta review chain that this data set had been pulled for over a year. Maybe we should not publish this paper. And that is it for this table.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers and discussants for this morning's first session. Thank you.